Hello everyone, my name is Sarachiku and I'm gonna read you a book called The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. Hope you will enjoy. Chapter 1, Start and Life. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country. My father, being a foreigner of Bremen, was settled first at Hull. He got a good estate by merchandise and living off his trade. Lived afterwards at York, from where he had married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country, and from whom I was called Robinson Crusoe, but by the usual corruption of words, in England we are now called Nay. We call ourselves and write our name Crusoe, and so my companions always call me. I had two older brothers. One of them was lieutenant colonel to an English regiment of foot in Flanders, formerly commanded by the famous Colonel Lockhart, and was killed in a battle near Dunkirk against the Spaniards. What became of my second brother I never knew, any more any my father and mother did know what was become of me. Being the third son of the family and not bred to any trade, my head began to be filled very early with rambling thoughts. My father, who was very anxious, that gave me an accomplishing share of learning as far as house education and country free school generally goes, and assigned me for the law. But I will be satisfied with nothing but going to sea, and my inclination to this led me so strongly against the will, nay, the commands of my father, and against all the entreaties and persuasions of my mother and other friends, that there seemed to be something fatal in that proportion of nature and then direction to life of misery, which was to befall upon me. My father, a wise, grave man, gave me a serious and excellent counsel against what he foresaw was my design. He called me on morning into his chamber, where he was confident, but he got an exposure very warmly which led me upon his subject. He asked me what reasons more than a mere wandering inclination I had for leaving my father's house and my native country, where I might be well introduced, and I had the prospect of raising my fortune by application and industry, which a life of ease and pleasure, he told me, and 'twas for men this spread fortune. One on one hand are expiring superior fortune, on the other who went abroad upon adventuring to rise by enterprise and make themselves famous, an undertaking of a nature out of the common road, that these things were all either too far above me or too far below me, that mine was the middle state, or what might be called the upper station of low life, which he had found by long experience was the best state in the world, the most suited to human happiness, not exposed to the miseries and hardships that the labor and sufferings of the mechanic part of mankind, and not embarrassed with the pride, luxury, ambition, and envy of the upper world part of the mankind. He told me I might judge of the happiness of this state by one thing, viz., that this was the state of life which all other people envied, that kings have frequently lament and miserable consequences of being born to great things, and wished there had been placed in the middle of the two extremes, between the mean and the great, that the wise man gave his testimony to this as he just standard of true felicity when he prayed to that have neither poverty of riches. He bid me observe it, and I will always find that calamities of life were shared among the upper and low part of mankind, but that the middle station had a few disasters and was not exposed to so many vicissitudes as the high or low part of mankind. Nay, they were not subject to so many disturbers and uneasiness, either of body or mind, as those were who, by vicious living, luxury, and extravagance on one hand, or by hard labor, went of necessaries and meant the insuffocated diet on the other hand bring the stabers upon themselves by nature consequences of their way of living, that the middle station of life was calculated of all kind of virtues and all kind of enjoyments, that peace and plenty were handmade, or the middle fortune, that temporary moderated quietness, health, society, and agreeable diversion, and all desirable pleasure were the blessings attended to the middle station of life, that this way man went silently and smoothly through the world, comfortably out of it, not embarrassed with the labor of the hand of it, had not sold to the life of slavery for daily bread, or harassed with perplexer circumstances, which rob the soul of peace and the body of rest, not enraged with the passion of envy or secret burning lust of ambition for the great things, but it ease circumstances lights generally through the world, and sensibly tasting the sweets of living without the bitter feeling that there were happy learning by everyday experience to know it more sincerely. After this he pressed me earnestly and its most affectionate manner not to play the young man, not to experience myself into miseries which nature and this station of life was born in seemed to have proved against that. I was under no necessary of seeking my bread, that he will do well for me, and endeavor to enter there thoroughly into the station of life which he had been just recommending to me, and that if I was not very easy and happy to the world, it must be my mere fate or fault that must hinder it, and that he should have nothing to answer for, having thus discharged his duty and warning me against measure which he knew will be to my hurt in a world that as he will do very kind things for me, if I will stay and settle at home as he directed, so you will not have so much hand in my misfortunes as to give me any encouragement to go away and to close all he told me. I had my elder brother for an example to whom he had used to the same earnings prison to keep him from going to the low country wars, but could not prevail. His younger desires prevented him to run into the army, where he was killed, until he said he will not chase to the prey for me. Yet he will venture to say to me that if I did take this foolish step, God will not bless me, and I would have leisure hereafter the reflection upon having neglected his counsel, when there might be none to assist in my recovery, I observed this last part of his discourse, which was truly prophetic, though I suppose my father did not know it to be so himself. I observed the tears run down his face very plentifully, and especially when he spoke of my brother who was killed, and that when he spoke of my having leisure to repent and none of to assist, he was so moved that he broke off the discourse and told me his heart was so full he could say no more to me. I was sincerely affected with the discourse, as indeed who could be otherwise, and I resolved not to think of going abroad any more, but so settled at home according to my father's desire. But at last a few days wore it all off, and in short, to prevent any of my father's further importunities, in a few weeks after I resolved to run quite away from him. However, I did not act so hastily, neither as my first heat of resolution prompted, but I took my mother at a time when I thought her little pleasanter than all ordinary, and told her that my thoughts were so entirely bent upon seeing the world that I should never settle to anything which resolved enough to go through with it, and my father had better give me his consent than force me to go without it. That I was now 18 years old, which was too late to go apprentice to a trade or clerk to an attorney. That I was sure if I did, I should never serve out my time, and I should certainly run away from my master before my time was out, and go to sea, if she will speak to my father to let me go, but on voyage abroad, if I came home again and did not like it, I will go no more, and I will promise by double diligence to recover that time I had lost. This put my mother into a great passion. She told me she knew it would be to no purpose to speak to my father upon any such objects, that he knew too well that my interest to give his consent to anything so much for my hurt, and that she wouldn't how I could. I took my mother and told her that my thoughts were so extremely bent upon seeing the world that I should never settle to anything. Think of anything such thing after such discourse as I had had with my father, and such kind and tending expressions as she knew my father had used to me, and that in short, if I will run myself, there was no helping me. I might the bend, I should never have their consent to it, that for her part she will not have so much hand in my destruction, and I shall never have it to say that my mother was willing when my father was not, though my mother refused to move it to my father, yet, as I have heard afterward, she reported all the discourse to him, and that my father afterward showed a great concern at it, said to her with sight, that the boy might be happy if he would stay at home, but if he goes abroad he will be the miserablest wretch that was ever born. I can give no consent to it. It was not till almost a year after this that I broke loose to. In the meantime, I continued obstinately deaf to all proposals, so settled to business and frequently exposed to duality with my father and mother, about their being so positively determined against what they knew. My inclination promoted me to but being one day at Hull, where I went casually and without any purpose of making elephant that time. But I say being there and one of my companions being going by sea to London and his father's ship and prompted me to go with them. With a common allurement of sailormen, viz. That it should cost me nothing for my passage. I consult neither father or mother any more, nor so much as send a word of it, but leaving them to hear of it as they might, without asking God's blessing of, or my father's, without any consideration of circumstances or consequences, and it an ill hour God knew. On this 1st of September 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London. Never any young adventure's misfortune, I believed, began sooner or continued longer than mine. The ship was no sooner gotten out of the harbour, but the wind began to blow and the waves to rise in a most frightful manner, and as I had never been at sea before, I was most inexperiencible, sick in body and terrified in my mind. I began now seriously to reflect upon what I had done, and how justly I was overtaken by the judgment of heaven for my act, leaving my father's house and abandoning my duty. All the good counselling of my parents, my father's tears, and my mother's entreaties came now fresh into my mind, and my conscience, which was not yet come to the pitch of hardness to which it had been since, reproached me with the contempt of advice and the breach of duty to God and my father. All this while the storm increased, and the sea, which I had never been upon before, went very high, though nothing like that what I have seen many times since, no, nor like that what I saw a few days after, but it was enough to affect me then, who was but a young sailor and had never known anything of the matter. I expected every wave would have swallowed us up, and that every time the ship fell down, as I thought, in the trough or hollow of the sea, we shall never rise more. And in this agony of mind I made many vows and resolutions that if I would please God here to spare my life this one voyage, if I got once my foot upon dry land again, I would go directly home to my father and never set into a ship again while I lived, that I will take his advice and never run myself into such miseries and there any more. Now I saw plainly the goodness of his observation about the middle station of life. How easy, how comfortably he had lived after his days, and never had been exposed to tempers at sea or trouble on shore, and I resolved that I would, like a true repented, prodigal, go home. My father, these wise and sober thoughts continued all the while the storm continued, and indeed, some time after, but next day, the wind was abandoned, and the sea calmer, and I began to be little inert to it. However, I was very grave for all the day, being also a little seasick. Still, but towards night the weather cleared up, the wind was quite over, and a charming fine evening followed. The sun went down perfectly clear and arose, so the next morning and having little or no wind, and a smooth sea, the sun shining upon it. The sight was, as I thought, most delightful that I ever saw. I had slept well in the night and was not more seasick, but very cheerful looking, which wonder upon the sea that was so rough and terrible the day before, and could be so calm and so pleasant in so little time after, and now lest more good resolutions should continue. My companion, who had indeed enticed me away, come to me. Well, Bob, says he, clapping me on the shoulder, how do you do after it? I warrant you were frightened, one, wasn't it? You last night when it blew, but capfully of wind, a capful dew. Call it? Said I. It was terrible storm. A storm, you fool, replies he. Do you call that a storm? Why, it was nothing at all. Give us but a good ship and sea rooms, and we think nothing such a squirrel of wind and that. But you're but a freshwater sailor, Bob. Come, let us make a bowl of a punch, and we'll forget all that. Do you see that charming weather? This now, to make short, the sad part of my story went the old way of all sailors. The punch was made, and I was made drunk with it, and that one night weakness I drowned all my repentance, all of my reflection upon my past conduct, and all my resolutions for my future. And the world as the sea was returned to its smoothness of surface and settled calmness by the abandon of the storm, so hurry of my thoughts, being over my fears and apprehensions of being swallowed upon the sea, being forgotten, and the current of my former desire returned entirely. Forgot the vows and promise that I made at my distress. I found indeed some intervals of reflection, and the serious thought did is, as it were, endeavor to return again. Sometimes, but I shook them off, and roused myself from them, as it were, from the slumber, and applied myself to drink and company, soon mastered the return of those fits, for so I called them, and I had in 5 or 6 days gotten a complete victory over concerns as any young fellow that resolved not to be troubled with its good desire, but I was to have another trial for it still, and Providence, as in such cases generally it does herself, to leave me entirely without excuse. For if I could not take this for a deliverance, the next was to be such a one as the worst and most hardened wretch among us would confess both danger and misery. The 6th day of our being at sea, we came into Yarburn roads. The wind having been contrary and the water calm, we had made but little way since the storm. Here we were obliged to come to an anchor, and here we lay. The wind continued contrary veers at the south west for 7 or 8 days, during which time a great many ships from Newcastle came into the same roads as the common harbour, where the ships might wait for a wind for the river. We had not, however, it here so long, but should have tightened it up the river, but that the wind blew too fresh, and after we had laid 4 or 5 days blew very hard. However, the road being reckoned as good as a harbour, the anchorage good, and our ground trackle very strong. Our men were unconcerned and not in the least apprehensive of danger, but spent the time in the rest and the mirror after the manner of the sea. But the 8th day in the morning the wind increased, and we all had all hands at work to strike our topmasts and make everything snug and close, that the ship might ride it as easy as possible. By noon the sea went very high indeed, and our ship rid forecastle and the ship several seas, and we thought once or twice our anchor had come home, upon which our mast ordered out of the sheet, so that we rode with 2 anchors ahead, and the cable veered out of the better end. By this time it blew a terrible storm indeed, and now I began to see a terror and amazement in the faces even of the seamen themselves. The master thought vigilant the business of preserving the ship, yet as he went in and out of his cabin by me, I could hear softly to himself say several times, "Lord, be merciful to us. We shall be all lost. We shall be all undone," and the like. During these first hurries I was stupid, lying still in my chamber, which was in a steerage and cannot describe my temper. I could ill resume, and the first penitence which I had so apparently trampled upon and hardened myself against a tough. I thought the bitterness of death had been past, and that this will be nothing to like the first, but when the master himself came by me, as I said just now, said we should be all lost, I was dreadful frightened. I got up out of my cabin and looked out, but such the small sight I never saw. The sea went mountains high and broke upon us every 3 or 4 minutes. When I could look about, I could see nothing but distress round us. 2 ships that were near us were found, had cut their masts mast by the board, being deep loaded, and our men cried out that a ship which rid about a mile ahead of us was foundered. Two more ships, being driven from their engine, were run out of the roads to sea at all. Adventures and that which not a master standard the light ship for, the best as not so much labouring in the sea, but two or three of them drove and came close by us, running away which only their spirits sail out before the wind. Towards evening the mad boatswain became the master of our ship to let them cut away the foremast, which he was very unwilling to, but boatswain protested to him that if he did not, the ship would founder. He consented, and when they had cut away the foremaster, the mainmast stood so loose and shook the ship so much they were obliged to cut their away also, and make a clear deck. Any one may judge what a condition I must be in all of this, who was but a young sailor and who had been in such fright before it. But a little, but if I can express at this distance the thought I had about me at the time, I was in tenfold more horror of mine upon account of my former convictions, and having returned from them to the resolution I had recklessly taken at first, that I was at death itself, and these added to the terror of storm put me into such condition that I can by no word describe it. But the worst was not come yet. The storm continued with such fury that the seamen themselves acknowledged there had never known a worst. We had a good ship, but she was deep loaded and wallowed in the sea. There the seamen every now and then cried out she would founder. It was my advantage in one respect, that I had not known what they meant by founder till I acquired. However, the storm was so violent that I saw what is not often seen. The master boatswain and some others more sensible than the rest, and their prayers, and expecting every moment when the ship would go to the bottom in the middle of the night, and under all the rest of our distress, one of the men that had been down on purpose to see cried out we had strung a leak. Another said there was 4 foot water in the hold. And all the hands were called to the pump, and that very word, my heart, as I thought, died within me, and I fell backwards upon side of my bed, where I sat into the cabin. However, the man roused me and told me that I that was able to do nothing before was as well able to pump as another, at which I stood up and went to the pump and worked very heartily. While this was doing, the master, seeing some light colors who not able to ride out the storm, were obliged to the slip and ran away to sea, and would come near us, ordered to fire a gun, as a signal of distress. I would know nothing what that meant. Was so surprised that I thought the ship had broken or some dreadful thing had happened in a word. I was so surprised that I fell down in a swoon, as this was Rim, when everybody had his own life to think of. Nobody minded me or what was become of me. But another man stepped up to the pump and thrusted me aside with his foot, let me lie thinking I had been dead, and it was great while before I came to myself. We worked on, but water increased and the hold was apartment. That ship would founder, and though the storm began to abate a little yet, as it was not possible she could swim till we might run into a port. So the master continued firing guns for help, and light ships who had drifted out just ahead of us ventured aboard to help us. It was with the utmost hazard the boat came near us, but it was impossible for us to get on board or for a board to lie near the ship's side till at least the men rowing very hurtingly and ventured their lives to save ours. Our men cast them a rope over their stern with Bereni to it, and then veered it our great length, which there after great labour and hazard took hold of, and hauled them close under our stern, and got all into their boat. It was to not purpose for them or us after we were in the boat to think of reaching to their own ship, so I all agreed to let her drive and only to pull her in towards shore as much as we could, and our master promised them that if the boat was starved upon the shore we would make it good to their master, so partly row and partly drive our boat went away to the northward, sloping towards the shore, almost as far as Wintertown-ness. We were not much more than a quarter of an hour out of our ship, but we saw her sink, and then I understood for the first time what was meant to be a ship foundering in the sea. I must acknowledge I had hardly eyes to look up when the seaman told me she was sinking. From that moment they rather put me into a boat than that I might be said to go in. My heart was as it were dead within me, partly with fright, partly with horror of mind and the thought of what was yet before me. While we were in the condition, the men yet labouring at the oar to bring the boat near the shore, we could see when our boat mounting the waves, we were able to see the shore and great manly people running along the shore to assist us when we should come near, but we made but slow way towards the shore, nor were we able to reach the shore till being past the lighthouse at Winder. The shore falls off to the western towards Quomers, and so the land broke off little the violence of the wind. And we got in, and though not without much difficulty, got all safe on shore and walked afterwards on foot to Yarmouth, where as unfortunate men we were used which great humanity as well by the magistrate of the town, who assigned us good quarters as by particularly merchants and owners of ships, and had money given us sufferance to carry us either to a London or back to Hull, as we thought fit. Had I now had the sense to have gone back to Hull, I have gone home and had been happy, and my father an emblem of our blessing Saviour's. Parental had even killed the father calf for me. Furring the ship, I went away and was cast away in the Yarmouth Road. It was a great while before he had any assurance that I was not drowned, but my ill fate pushed me on now with obscenity that nothing could resist, and though I had several times to load calls for my reason and my more compound judgment to go home, yet I had no power to do it. I know not what to call this, nor will I urge that it is a secret, overruling the creed that hurries us on to be the instrument of our own destruction. Every doubt it be before us, and that we rush upon it with our eyes open. Certainly nothing but some such degrees unavoidable misery attended, and which it was impossible for me to escape, could have pushed me towards again the calm reasoning and persistence of my most retired thoughts, and again two such visible instruments as I had met with in my first attempt. My comrade, who had held too hard on me before and who was the master's son, was no less forward than I. The first time he spoke to me after we were at Yarmouth, which was not till 2 or 3 days for, we were separated in the town to several quarters. I say the first time he saw me at the apparent, his tone was altered and looked very melancholy, and shaking his head asked me how I did, and tell his father who I was and how I had come this Yawaga only for trial in order to go farther abroad. His father turned to me with very grave and concerned tone. "Young man," he says, "you ought never to go to sea any more. You ought to take this for a plain and visible token that you are not to be severed man." "Why, sir," said I, "will you go to sea no more?" "That is another case," said he. "It is my calling, that therefore my duty, but as made this you voyage for trial, you see what I test heaven had given you of what you are to expect. If you persist, perhaps this will has all befall us on your account, like Yonaha and the ship, the rashes. Pray," continued he, "what are you, and on what account did you go to sea?" Upon that I told him some of my story, at the end of which he burst out with a strange kind of passion. "What had I done," says he, "that such an unhappy wretch could come into my ship I would not set my foot into the same ship with 3 again for £1,000. This indeed was, as I said, an excursion of his spirits, which were yet agitated by the sense of his loss, and was farther than he could have ordered to go. However, he afterwards talked very gravely to me, accorded to me, go back to my father, and not tempt Providence to my ruin, told me I might see a visible hand of heaven against me, and a young man, said he, depends upon it, if you do not go back, however you go, you will meet with nothing but disaster and disappointment till your father's words are fulfilled upon you. We part soon after, for I made him little answer, and I saw him no more which way he went. I knew not. As for me having some money in my pocket, I travelled to London by land, and there as well as on the road had many struggles with myself what course of life I shall take, and whether I shall go home or go to sea. As the go home shame opposed to the best motion had offered to my thoughts, it immediately occurred to me how I shall be laughed at among the neighbors, and I shall be ashamed to see not my father and mother only, but even everybody else, from where I have since often observed how incongruence and irritation the common temper of mankind is, especially of young youth, to that reason which ought to guide them in such cases, viz., that they are not ashamed to sin, and yet are ashamed to repeat, not ashamed of action of which they ought justly to be esteemed fools, but are ashamed of the returning, which only can make them be esteemed wise men. In this state of life, however, I remained some time uncertain what measure to take and what course of life to lead, and an irresistible reflection continued to go home, and as I stayed a while, the remembrance of the distress I had been in the worst of, and as that abated the little motion I had in my desires to return, whereof with it till at last I laid aside thought of it and looked out for Yaga, that evil influence which carried me first away from my father's house, that hurried me into the wild and indigested notion of raising my fortune, and that impressed those conceits too forcibly upon me, as to make me deaf to all good advice, and to entreaties and even command of my father. I say the same influence, whatever it was, present the most unfortunate of all enterprises to my view, and I went on board a vessel bound to the coast of Africa, or as our sailors vulgarly called it, a voyage to Uganda. It was my great misfortune that in all these adventures I did not ship myself a sailor, whereby though I might indeed have worked a little harder than ordinary, yet at the same time I had learned the duty and office of a foremaster, and in time might have qualified myself for a maid of low intent, for a master, but as it was, my fate too. Choose for the worse, so I did here, for have money in my pockets and good clothes upon my back. I will always go on board in the habit of a gentleman, and so I neither had my business to the ship or learned to do any